Let's have a hand for Jughead. Sabrina greets the audience unnecessarily and says the gang's having a picnic. We couldn't have figured that out on our own. I never liked that Moose said duh. That's unnecessary too. Veronica can't get the fire started so that they can eat, and Reggie says he's great at lighting matches, making a lame pun when he's supposed to see himself as cool. Ethel chases Jughead, and because of that, the match ends up falling into the water. So Sabrina uses magic to generate thunder and sends a storm cloud over to hit something with lightning and create fire. Betty assumes that it must have been smoldering for a long time. At least this part didn't happen in the comic version of the story. But now it's just like the comic story, complete with familiar dialogue, as Ethel gets caught in her own trap for Jughead, somehow. Sabrina uses magic, saying to change Jughead into a regular tiger so that he can want to be with Ethel, and somehow he turns into a tiger, but doesn't look nearly as great as in the comic, having his normal head, which makes less sense. Sabrina turns him back to normal. Yeah, what did go wrong? Ambrose greets Sabrina and explains that he's here looking for toadstools for a potion, and she casually gets away with telling him that she's trying to use a love spell on Jughead, not respecting his consent. He reads the book and tells her that she has to grasp his hand first. Seen it. Ethel makes a stereotypical trap, having leaves covering a hole, and when Sabrina tells Jughead to come here, Ethel gets mad and stomps on a tree branch, making him fall. She gets mad at Sabrina for talking to Jughead and runs away because of her. Archie tells everyone that there's burgers ready, and Betty rings a triangle. Then Ethel hides in a giant hollow hamburger she had prepared ahead of time. How much do these traps cost her? At least I don't remember this from the comic. The smell of burgers causes an animal from a cave to walk around sniffing the air, and it heads towards a fake burger that looks too small for Ethel to fit in. And somehow she's unharmed when it goes into it with her, and it freaks out and runs away. No wonder they got rid of this for the comic version. Well, I don't know which came first. This made no sense and was jarringly dark. What's also original from the Laugh Out comic is that Jughead starts rowing a canoe away from Ethel and she paddles on a log. Both of them are surprisingly athletic. Ethel said she's really falling for him when she already did long ago, and he tells her to look out because she's about to go over a waterfall. She just barely avoids falling over it because of her paddling somehow, just to fall in anyways after being glad that Jughead does care about her. Then it goes back to being just like the comic when Ethel talks about a trap where she'll try to fool Jughead with a hamburger bush, and then shoot an arrow to make a haystack fall on him. Somehow Moose gets fooled by the hamburger bush Jughead wasn't fooled by, and says he always thought they grew on trees. So hay falls in it because he somehow thought burgers grew on bushes, and Sabrina grabs his hand instead of knowing Jughead well enough by now to not mistake Moose's big hands for Jughead's. So somehow she makes Moose fall in love with Ethel even though she wasn't imagining Moose at all. It is cringeworthy, but also kind of satisfying that Ethel gets karma after spending all episode not respecting Jughead's consent. Moose's funny voice is what makes it amusing that he says they can't fight it and it's written in the stars.
It's written in the stars!
I found this story really boring because I've already seen its plot in a comic in the Sabrina Complete Collection trade paperback. It's nice to see it in motion with silly music and color, and it's not the episode's fault that I already saw the comic. There were some things that were original to the plot of the episode, but they were the parts of it that made the least sense. Somehow Ethel survives a big wild animal trying to go into the big fake burger she was hiding in, and it just runs away scared, and she survives falling over a waterfall after Jughead canoes away from her. Everything else was the same plot as in a comic story I already read. So it was the most boring episode I've seen so far. Sabrina feels sorry for Ethel because Jughead doesn't want to date her. So even though Ethel's going out of her way to make herself the bad guy by building traps for Jughead, Sabrina tries to cast a love spell on Jughead, rather than a spell to make Ethel leave Jughead alone. But somehow, she needs to grasp his hand to do it. Ethel's really talented building those traps, but she's still making a fool out of herself. The new Freeway. When the mailman's coming over to Sabrina's house, Hilda hopes she won first prize and uses magic to make a letter from the mailman fly over to her, freaking him out into quitting. And she cheers and says it says official business, so it must be about the contest. Sabrina politely says she'll read it for her, and she reveals that there's a letter telling them to leave the house because it's going to be torn down to make room for a freeway. I spent the whole episode wondering how this could be legal. Hilda uses magic to summon a tank, and she somehow doesn't recognize Weatherby as the school principal after all the time of raising Sabrina. Once she had been to her school a lot, she somehow thinks he's the enemy, and he reveals that he actually used to be a soldier himself, and the tank vanishes without him seeing it. And he tells Grundy to just give her name and serial number, so she tells them to come in from out in the sun. Why would he say that to her when she's clearly not a soldier? Sabrina wants to make sure that the freeway won't get built without exposing them as witches. Zelda says they could change the route, and when Hilda wants to use magic for it, arbitrarily, Sabrina tells her not to use magic. Salem, despite being all about abusing magic, somehow agrees with her and tells her silently to make a protest to try to save her house. Him not being able to actually talk just wastes time. Weatherby walks around and says that all of a sudden, his arms filled up with signs. It's educational that this episode is going to show that the gang's protesting will do absolutely nothing. But it's also irritating padding, as after Sabrina wastes time telling her aunts that there's nothing to worry about, we see some demolition crew show up at the house with a wrecking ball. It's forced that all of the employees look mean, and the one at the wrecking ball is smirking. They just be reluctant and hate their jobs here. It's satisfying to see Hilda turn their boss into a kid asking for his mama. Then she returns them to normal for some reason, and messes with someone else as well. The bad guy that Jughead's talking to doesn't even try to explain why he's having a freeway be built in the first place. He complains that Hot Dog's tail is brushing the freeway map. Archie says it brushed a line off the map. It was just an accidental pencil mark. The freeway actually misses Sabrina's house by several blocks. I have a very hard time believing that a dog's tail could erase a pencil line. It's not an eraser. Sabrina should have been here, and the writing isn't even trying to explain why the guy wanted to build a freeway so bad that he was fine with destroying a person's house. It's strawmanning. Hilda wastes a ton of time frustrating me by saying goodbye to her house. There is no believability to this. I know she's one person, but she's still a witch. She at least explains that she's too exhausted to use her magic. And I've read the comic, so I know they can run out of magic. Sabrina says that if she uses magic to stop the bull, they're sure to find out they're witches. She should also say, if she uses magic to brainwash them into leaving, people will also find out they're witches. Because she'll have to keep doing that every time they get fired. She uses magic to make the lunch whistle sound, and summons a table for them to eat at. Hilda says she saved their house. Archie shows up and tells Sabrina the Deus Ex Machina good news. Somehow Jughead asks what was that when he hears Hilda cheering, when he should recognize her voice by now. And for no reason, Sabrina lies about what that was. The guy is a toast to their gracious host Sabrina, and it's satisfying that now his house is actually the one being threatened, and he runs away. This story about omnipotent witches somehow managed to get an entire episode out of the confusing idea that a freeway is going to be built where Sabrina's house is, demolishing it. I have a hard time believing that would be legal in America, so that's confusing the whole time. But what's even worse is that somehow none of the witches in the house get the idea that they can simply brainwash the demolition crew as a whole to decide to not wreck their house. It's in character for Hilda to waste magic messing with people. But Sabrina and Zelda should have known better when Sabrina brainwashes people all the time. Somehow, she only gets the idea to make them take a break for lunch. She at least explains that she doesn't want to expose witchcraft by using magic on the bull, and Hilda explains that she's exhausted all of her magic defending the house. But still, it's frustrating that I'm expected to believe that these witches became helpless and couldn't defend the house and needed saving. Hilda would have just turned them all into frogs. Jughead's dog waving his tail somehow erased a pencil line that was there by mistake over Sabrina's house, even though it's not an eraser. And that saved it from destruction. It really should have been Sabrina, not a dog. Hilda's uses of magic make the existence of magic obvious anyways, or at least one of them does. At that point, why doesn't she just get rid of the wrecking ball outright and let them argue over who stole it?